I love simple things. I like getting outside. I like stopping and smelling the lilacs and the tulips that are just starting to kind of poke their way into our world. Our world here in Colorado that has been starved of all things green through the long winter. And I like drawing simple things too. I spend a lot of time drawing really complicated things, intricate things, where I have to sit and think about perspective, figure out what's happening from a three-dimensional standpoint, and there's a lot of thought that goes into that kind of drawing. And yet, I also enjoy drawing simple things, little cartoons. Sometimes there's still the robots and dragons that I love so much, but quite frequently, they're just something different entirely. A little while back, I drew a series of vegetables. I didn't record any of them for sessions, though they are on some thumbnails from a while back. And these were just like potatoes and carrots with faces holding up signs, kind of vaguely encouraging things. These were really fun to make and really goofy, but they were simple. I had so many fewer things to contemplate as I was drawing those. And what you're watching happen in the background here is actually the same kind of thing. This is from Smogust in 2024. And if you haven't participated in that or any other challenge, I would encourage you this year in 2025 to try out doing something along those lines. It was a really fun challenge with several different, actually not several, but 30 different prompts for all these different dragons that you could draw over the course of the month. This one was Tar. And I had done a lot of dragons before this, some of them incredibly detailed, whole bodies, trying to think about different ways that I can represent this kind of archetypical dragon in a really interesting and fundamental way. But I got tired of it. Because of course I did. Working on large drawings that were hyper detailed for 2-3 weeks solid took a toll, and I needed a break. So I decided to do something simple. Not only is the design here simple, but it's actually reminiscent of some dragon-like creatures called Hirons from Magi Nation, which was a card game that I played in high school and really enjoyed. I loved the art style of it. It was far more cartoony and with a little bit of an anime flair as well. But it was really fun. There were quotes on almost all of the cards, and they were funny distortions of things from Princess Bride and Star Wars and all these other things. The people who built the game really had a good thing going. I was bummed when the game crashed, but the people who were designing it were far more dedicated to making beautiful things in a game that functioned well than running a business that worked well, it seems. But this is actually reminiscent of the design of one of the creatures from that very game, from a Tar Hiron, if I'm not remembering incorrectly. It might have been a Shadow Hiron, actually. All of them had this similar facial structure, and so I went and pulled up one of the designs and used that as the inspiration for this. And it is fairly close to that original design, though I'm obviously illustrating it in my own kind of pen and ink way. This was a simplification of my process too. It was easier to go find something and riff off of it than it was to create something from nothing, ex nihilo. There is a place for that, obviously. In fact, most of the work I do on this channel, most of the work that I show off, is work that is entirely from my own mind, generally with some manner of reference material. But there's nothing wrong with working from and being inspired by other people's work. It helps you to simplify things. And we need simplistic art sometimes. There's nothing wrong with that. People will often throw cartoons and anime and manga under the bus. In fact, not that many days ago, I got a comment on a video I made a very long time ago about why your art teacher hates anime. And one of the comments was basically just, well, because it's trash, because it's a terrible art form. And I didn't reply to the comment because a person who talks that way, who replies like that, is not looking to be convinced. They're not looking for a well-meaning argument. They have a stance and they are committed to it. And so me replying is not going to do anything good. But frankly, they're just wrong. To throw any art form wholesale into the trash bin feels incredibly ignorant to me. I understand, that there are certain art forms that are more sophisticated than others, and that's fine. In fact, personally, I would say the highest form of human art is subtractive stone sculpture. But That's not something I do. It's not something that's done very frequently at all anymore. Taking a giant chunk of stone and slowly removing material until you have this beautiful thing beneath it. I think if you look at artists specifically like Bernini, he probably, in my mind, was the most gifted artist of all time. I am fine and comfortable saying things like that. But I'm far, far less comfortable saying that this particular art form, like photography, is a lesser art form. I'd be comfortable saying it's less sophisticated, and that's fine. We can't have 5-star cuisine for every single meal. If we do, it destroys the comparison and the juxtaposition, and we are going to find that normal, and it no longer will bring the joy that it can when it's juxtaposed against chicken nuggets and just normal daily food. All of that is the full spectrum of what it is to be human, to enjoy a wide array of different things. Simple art is a good thing. It might be a good thing for you all of the time, to engage in things that are simpler, that are easier for you to jump in and out of. One of the aspects of this that is so beneficial is you can often see results very quickly. You can finish things very quickly, which for some of us is exactly what we need. We need art that we can jump into, we can rattle something off and be done with it. Maybe this is an ADHD thing, maybe it's just a personality trait. There are times where I don't want to come back to the piece of artwork that I've been working on for 7 or 8 hours. I want to jump in and do something that's going to take me 5 minutes. Simple art is a good solution for that. Art that is a break from the more complicated things. And there are artists that this is the only form of art they do. The other side of this is that you will grow much faster. If you work on smaller pieces that you can complete in a, rational amount of time, you are generally going to grow in that pursuit much more swiftly. I often talk to my students about this, especially students who had put, a dozen hours into each piece they finished. And if I had them for years, they would sometimes talk about how they didn't feel like they were growing quickly enough. The hard part with this is that as artists, we grow a finite amount for every project, every drawing, every painting that we complete. And it seems that the vast majority of that growth is in the beginning of the piece and the end of the piece. And so if you spend 12 hours on a painting, the growth is generally occurring in the sketching phase, in the setup phase, in the blocking phase, in making sure all your proportions are, working together in the composition. And then also in the finishing phase, in that last hour or so when you're touching things up, you're polishing up details. And if you shorten that, if you make it a much simpler painting, a much simpler piece, you're going to grow faster because you're going to go through the cycle more quickly. This is why when you are taking a class or you have a teacher that's pushing you to practice or to sketch a bunch before you start projects, that's the idea there, that you are going to grow more swiftly as an artist if you iterate quickly. I find that this is almost always true. The only problem is if you never actually complete projects. If you only ever practice, then you get really efficient at practicing. Practicing for the sake of something else will help. But these simplified drawings, if you take on little comics or cartoons that you can post on Instagram, or even drawings like I'm working on here, which is still rather complicated. It took me 40 some minutes to complete. However, it's very simple compared to a lot of the other dragons. Some of the pieces that I've had for podcasts on here are pieces that took me 10 or 15 hours to do. So something that's less than an hour is obviously a much smaller scale piece. When I get to the end of something like this, I can evaluate what worked well and what didn't and move on. And if you think about it, if I did 10 or 12 of these in the time that it took me to do one of those big pieces, I am going to grow far more as an artist in that span of time. This is more, I suppose, in defense of simplistic or simplified art, not just saying you should do this. I think it is often a good break from things, but at least for this point, I'm more talking about how it's something that needs defended sometimes, because there are a lot of artists out there, especially older artists, who tend to look down on this simple art. I guess I don't mean older age-wise, I mean older they've been in it for a while. These are the kinds of people I ran into when I was at university studying art, people who had dedicated their lives to a singular pursuit, and there's always an intrinsic human need to support and validate yourself for what you've dedicated time toward. So when you go to school and you try to push a teacher or a professor on something, they will often resist, because if they are to acknowledge that your position might be accurate or might be different than theirs, especially if those two work in tandem, then they have to realize that perhaps the things they've thought might not have been true, and they might in fact have to reevaluate things. This is often what happens with people with very strong political or religious views, right? Things that they don't like being challenged on. There is a psychological phenomenon that's happening there, where if you are to wrap your head around the fact that perhaps the view you've held for a long time might not be substantiated or might not be right, that it might force you to deal with the fact that you have held an incorrect view for a long time. That's uncomfortable, and humans, by and large, will avoid discomfort. So sometimes when you run into this with art teachers, it's going to be that same thing. They're going to resist you, not because of anything that has to do with you, but because of the fact that they've held to that view so long that to reject it now would perhaps be a very uncomfortable situation for them. I suppose all of that is to say that simplified art has a role in your playbook. Whether it is something that you want to use as your constant go-to and you felt some pressure in the past not to engage in those things because they're less sophisticated or because they're less important, you can kind of push against those ideas. Those are old school notions. And even if, like I stated earlier, simplified art is less sophisticated, it is by definition. A simplified drawing is obviously more simple than a complicated drawing, and therefore less sophisticated. Not less sophisticated in the meaning it can convey, in the importance that it has, but literally just less sophisticated in the means of construction. This means you can iterate faster, it means you can have more results, it means you can evaluate how you're doing better and move across things more quickly. But sometimes, for those of us who've been in art for a long time, it can just be freeing to engage in something that is different than what we normally engage in. I get fatigued working on these large projects, and perhaps you do too. And so sometimes jumping into something that's a little bit simpler can just be good for the soul. And we need that. Art is hard. It's this weird, arduous, joy-filled journey that is an amalgamation of everything that constitutes what it is to be human, all wrapped up into a pencil. It doesn't make any sense, and yet it makes all the sense in the world. And that is strange and weird, and the people that are outside of your particular artistic realm are not going to understand it. They're not going to understand the struggles that you're having, and that's okay. I actually talked at one point in either a podcast or a sketchbook session about how you don't need to try to get your non-artistic people in your life to understand you. I'm not sure they're capable of it. This might go back to that thing I mentioned a few minutes ago, actually, of if they wrap their head around the fact that you are different because you're artistic and have a need to be creative, and maybe they rejected that in their own life because they had the same desires, or they didn't, but they just didn't think that it existed in people. For them to wrap their head around that means they have to reject a past known, and that is very, very difficult for most humans. And it's a waste of our time generally to try to convince people and pull people to our side of things and understand me. Not everybody will, and that's okay. It would be lovely if all humans understood one another, if there was less prejudice and discrimination, and we could just understand that because somebody else functions in a different manner than we do, that's just life. But wishful thinking, I suppose. Anyway, this has been quite rambly, so I hope you've drawn something as you've listened, and maybe as you've watched this interesting, weird tar dragging come into being. What do you want to hear about next, though? In the next session, what would you like me to chat about? If you don't mind leaving a comment with any kind of questions or suggestions, things that I've talked about before and you want me to expand, or perhaps something that just popped into your mind, please let me know in the comments below. I would love to address those. It's always more enjoyable to respond to questions and comments rather than to just reach into my own ethereal mindscape and pull things out. Feels like I'm talking to another human when I do that, rather than talking to this strange line that moves across my screen and tells me how many seconds I've been chatting into the ether. But as always, thank you for being here, for listening and participating. If you haven't checked out our Discord server yet, I would recommend that you do so. It is linked in the description down below and gives you access to a whole bunch of different channels and people who can give you some feedback on your artwork, or even just places to share memes about what it is to be an artist in 2025. Thank you to my patrons as well, who are on the screen now. If you want to check out my Patreon, it is linked below. It gives you access to exclusive videos, the ability to see what I'm up to in the time outside of YouTube, voting on upcoming content, sometimes seeing scripts and outlines before I put them together, and mostly just gives you an ability to support what I do here. So if you enjoy this, if it's beneficial to you, please consider checking that out, but no pressure. All right, well, have a good one, y'all. I'll see you soon.